Did you know that the European Union will be working on amending the European climate law this year? The importance of this law cannot be understated. It is the European climate law that defines the goals set out in the European Green Deal to become climate neutral by 2050. Of the many ways possible to become climate neutral, today we are going to focus on what is, I admit, a rather niche topic: carbon dioxide removal.
In general, carbon removal as a process occurs obviously naturally. We have trees, we have all sort of vegetation that just stores CO2 for photosynthesis. So it's not a novel concept. It's just that now we're also looking into more technological solutions because at this point we're meeting way beyond what our forests can naturally absorb because they just cannot keep up with the speed at which we are polluting.
From Friends of Europe, this is Policy Voices. I'm Catarina Vila Nova. If you haven't already, please take a moment now to subscribe to Friends of Europe's podcast wherever you're listening to this now, to never miss an episode of Policy Voices. Today on the show, what is carbon removal and what are the costs of not removing it? I'm joined by Anna Costova, Senior Policy Analyst at Carbon Gap, an organization focusing on scaling up just and effective carbon dioxide removal. Here's our conversation.
Anna, you are a senior policy analyst at Carbon Gap. Carbon Gap is an organization that says that without carbon removal, there is no net zero. Can you explain the connection between these two elements?
Sure. Well, let's start with net zero as the bigger one. Net zero essentially is a state of balance between all the greenhouse gases, all the CO2 that we put into the atmosphere and those that we take out or remove. So ideally, we reach this point of balance where we don't emit more than we can take out and then even go beyond that to go net negative. The EU actually has a binding ambition. We want to be net zero by 2050. We're doing a lot for it. There are a lot of measures. First of all, of course, you need to start reducing your emissions. You need to decarbonize a lot of processes. And there are a lot of measures happening. But at the same time, we also know that some processes are incredibly hard or prohibitively expensive to decarbonize. And maybe by 2050, we may still have some remaining emissions. So think of aviation or agriculture. These are particularly tricky. I think some heavy industry as well. So if we want to reach this net zero target, which is actually binding for us, then we also need to think about how do we remove that CO2 that we cannot fully reduce. And this is where carbon removal comes in.
So let's get a bit more specific. What do we mean when we talk about net zero and carbon neutrality? Because in my mind, I've always thought about net zero that we just won't emit any carbon dioxide anymore. And I think perhaps it's a bit of a misleading definition. So can you get even more specific and explain also what are the goalposts here, like net zero based on when or based on what?
Yeah. So net zero, I think, is a concept you can pinpoint it to any decade. Really, it was a political decision that we're going for net zero by 2050. Of course, I think it's a very obvious question. Why can't we just reduce all the emissions? It'd be perfect. I think this is what we should definitely strive for. Reduce emissions as much as possible because, the best ton of CO2 is the ton that was never emitted because it never contributed to the global warming. But realistically, there are a lot of things coming into play here. So it is very likely that by 2050, when we're obliged to reach net zero, we will still have some emissions remaining. Carbon neutrality is a linked concept. You see, it's only carbon, whereas net zero is about all kinds of emissions. So of course, we have greenhouse gases that it's not only CO2, there are all the other ones. So we actually always say that we have to be carbon neutral before we are climate neutral, right? Climate neutrality is kind of the bigger concept. Within this, we have carbon neutrality and CDR. As it is, we only deal with carbon for now.
So, of course, ideally, there would be no emissions whatsoever, but that's let's be realistic, that's just not going to happen, at least not in our lifetimes, at least. And you mentioned some areas that are, or some sectors, let's just say it, that are notoriously difficult in this area, such as aviation, agriculture. So which sectors seem to be more promising when it comes to CDR or net neutrality? Net zero and carbon neutrality. Here I am mixing the two concepts.
Yeah,
It's confusing. So which sectors seem to be more promising, or maybe this is not the right way to go about things? Should we just aim to reduce as much as possible just across the board?
Yeah, we should definitely aim to reduce as much as possible across the board. We know that some sectors out there have the potential to go full carbon neutral. I think the power sector, the electricity generation, it's very promising. And there are a lot of hopes that, it won't need any carbon removals to help it. But then aviation is really difficult because of, all the fuels and the processes. And what else? Heavy industry, agriculture is always very tricky because it's also linked to points like food security. You remember the protests back in the day. So it's always a very tricky political playoff. So we just know that, from the climate protection, we just know that there will be some sectors that will still be emitting by 2050, despite all the decarbonization efforts, either because it's just impossible to decarbonize. There are just some processes that require high temperatures, and for that, we need to burn and share fossil fuels, or there are other processes where it's just incredibly expensive. So for them, it might be a better way to so-called offset the emissions or balance out the emissions. But I really want to emphasize, we're talking about a very small share of emissions. That this is what we call residual emissions. So those emissions that are left when everything is decarbonized and all the emission reduction measures have been put in place. So that very, very small share is left for carbon removal to cover.
I just want to pick on something an expression that you mentioned that is quite controversial, this offsetting. So this idea that, in my opinion, it puts a lot of burden on the consumers. So let's say you buy a plane ticket and you're offered this opportunity to offset part of your emissions by, let's say, planting trees in the Amazon. There's been so much reporting on this, on that some companies that offer these offsetting opportunities are just pure scams that just don't work, or at least they are just, by the time that they offset, it's going to be in 10, 20, 50 years time. Is there any good way of offsetting emissions, any ethical way, any way that actually works?
Yeah, I think this is where regulation plays a big part, because when you're being offered to, plant a tree in the Amazon flight, all of this is operating on what we call a voluntary carbon market. So it's a market where, you can pay a price for a ton of CO2, but the companies are doing it not because they're mandated to do it, but because they're choosing to do so. It would be because they have made their own climate neutrality pledges and now trying to produce credits, or because, for reputational reasons. For example, they want to look like a green company to a consumer. So yeah, right now there are a lot of issues that are happening with all of these credits. And I think this is where, and also I would say there are different types of credits. Of course, there are emission reduction credits. So for example, you buy credits and then the money goes to into investments into some sort of renewable installations. And then carbon removal credits are a bit of a different bucket here. The thing about these credits is that the durability of removals really needs to match the durability of the emission. So let's take your example. For example, you buy a plane ticket, and obviously the emissions that we have in place are fossil emissions, right? From burning, burning the fuel. So to say that you plant a tree and you're going to offset emissions that are going to be in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, and the tree may as well burn down next week. Yeah, that's greenwashing. That's a very clear case of greenwashing. And that's why we call for this like-for-like principle. This is one of, it's a principle that we use in the CDR sector. But essentially, emissions and removals should be matched like-for-like. So if we're talking about CO2, something that's going to be in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, then we need to match it with a removal credit that's also going to store CO2 for several hundreds of years. And this way, we can not only reach net zero, hopefully eventually, but also durable net zero that lasts and that is done with high integrity. And there are a few initiatives that the EU is working on. One of these is green claims. It's a green claims directive. It actually regulates these claims that companies make toward consumers. And one of our big asks is that, first of all, when we talk about offsetting, it should only be carbon removal because, the only way you can neutralize emissions that are out there is by taking the same amount from the atmosphere. And secondly, we should only be focusing or prioritizing permanent carbon removals because these are very potent gases and they're going to have a warming impact for hundreds of years.
So, if in a nutshell, we think of carbon dioxide removal as removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, we can't just erase it. We can, it's just not something that you can dispose of. You have to store it, all this carbon dioxide. So, what are the processes through which CDR can happen? Where can it be stored? What are the pros and cons? If you can just name a few here.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in general, carbon removal as a process occurs obviously naturally. We have trees, we have all sort of vegetation that just stores CO2 for photosynthesis. So it's not a novel concept. It's just that now we're also looking into more technological solutions because at this point we're meeting way beyond what our forests can naturally absorb because they just cannot keep up with the speed at which we're polluting. So in general, when we talk about carbon removals, we kind of divide it into two families based on the duration of storage. So on the one hand, we have those so-called nature-based solutions. So a lot of these processes occur naturally, and they include, for example, forests, right? So trees absorb CO2 as they grow and they store it in the wood and the roots in the soil. And there are different ways of managing these trees. There is also soil carbon, where through certain farming practices, we store more CO2 in the soil. There are all sort of CDR methods that are linked to managing marine ecosystems, like mangroves and seagrasses. And then on the other hand, we have more permanent or novel CDR, more technological solutions. I think the first one that would come to mind is direct air capture. Maybe we've heard about these big fans that suck CO2 from the air, and then from there we store it. There are different ways of burning biomass. So the plants that absorb CO2, and then we take it, we burn it, we capture the CO2. There are other different processes that sort of artificially speed up natural occurrences. For example, mineralization. Through some chemical processes, carbon is then permanently locked in a solid rock. So these give us durability of several hundreds of years to millennia, whereas with nature-based solutions, it's a temporary situation. We're talking about several decades maybe at best. And of course, the risk of reversal is also way higher because, a forest fire and bam, all the CO2 that's been stored, it's re-emitted back in the atmosphere. So it's a great solution. And it has its applications. It definitely has its use cases. It comes at a lower cost. We know how to deal with it. But at the same time, if we're talking about these long-lasting fossil emissions, it's more the permanent novel CDR that we're looking towards. And some of these technologies, while very promising, they still have some gaps when it comes to research because it's very important that we do this responsibly, that we don't just cause a bunch of damage along the way as we scale up. And also quite a lot of these are fairly costly. We're talking about now between $100 to $500 per ton. So it's definitely not accessible. Yeah, because they're at early stages. And obviously, as we scale up, the cost goes down. But this is where we really need to stimulate demand because if you look at who buys these credits from technological permanent removals, it's essentially the same 10 companies. It's Microsoft and a bunch of others, which is just not enough. And this is why we need more demand stimulation. And this is where the governments come in. I think one way of thinking about CDR is like waste management. It's not inherently profitable, but it has to be done. Otherwise, it's a really messed up world. And this is why a lot of government funding goes into waste management. And this is why CDR also requires quite a lot of government support at the beginning. But then we expect a market to occur, and then this market will be self-sustained, hopefully, as long as there are some compliance mechanisms. And also, I think it's important to think about the cost of not doing CDR, because it might be expensive, but if we think about it, we need CDR, we need to remove carbon to slow down climate change. And if we don't do this, we see, every summer Europe is on fire, California is on fire. So this is already the cost of climate change. And I think a lot of countries around Europe, a lot of ministries are thinking along these lines. What is the cost of not doing it? And it's pretty high.
Definitely, the cost of inaction is absolutely a narrative and the theme that you hear a lot when you talk about climate action. Of all these methods that you just described, which ones, as far as you know, are already being implemented across the EU? So, of course, apart from the natural methods, the trees and so on, the ones that are of a more technological nature, which ones do you know that are already being implemented and are already being put to good use across the EU?
Well, there are definitely companies that do all of these methods. If we're looking at, even at the permanent side, it's just the scale that differs. So for direct air capture, I guess it's one of the more advanced methods. We have Climeworks in Europe. I think they're Swiss-based, and they have projects in Iceland. So they have pretty big installations. There is actually a direct air company that operates in Brussels. We just went to see it. So it's pretty incredible to think that it not only is it happening now, CDR, it's literally happening where we are. And it's great. And the company, they have their pilot in Kenya, but the technology development happens here in Brussels. Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage is also pretty developed. We have Stockholm Exergy in Sweden. I think they're fairly advanced. And then enhanced weathering by mineralization, I think they might be at slightly earlier stages, also because there's still some research needed to make sure that we do this responsibly and we have all the best data before we scale up.
So an issue that I'm thinking about is that of capacity. So as you already mentioned, the thing with trees and forests is that as soon as they are burned, is all the carbon that was being stored in those trees is immediately released into the atmosphere, and so the process has to start all over again. You mentioned some methods that can store carbon dioxide for up to millennia, but so there is, just to be clear, there is no way to completely destroy carbon dioxide, correct? So it always has to be stored.
It has to be stored, yeah.
So what I'm thinking is, again, this issue of capacity. What are the limits of the capacity of our planet to store carbon dioxide? I mean, until when can we keep going this way?
Yeah, that's a very fair question. To be honest, I don't have a number off the top of my head, but we definitely have pretty extensive capacity in Europe. Most of it is offshore. So you think about the North Sea, in the Baltic Sea. So all these underground formations in Iceland as well, where we can just pour the CO2 underground and then it solidifies and then it just becomes rock. But onshore as well, I guess here you can think of a few countries where it's been a matter of public debate. Do we want this or not? There are a few countries in Europe where there's currently a moratorium on onshore storage. But this idea is slowly changing. They're revising the rules because they understand that this capacity is much needed. And if you have the right regulation in place, if you have very stringent environmental processes, we understand that this is fairly safe.
Let's talk about the EU climate law that the European Commission is going to be revising this year. In a nutshell, what does this law entail?
Yeah, of course. The European climate law is probably one of the most important pieces of climate regulation in the EU, and it writes into law our goal to become net zero by 2050. So this is a binding ambition. We have to do it. And then also the ambition of going net negative beyond. So we talked about the balance that is net zero, But at some point, we also want to be removing more CO2 than we're emitting. It also sets the interim ambition of minus 55 net greenhouse gas reduction targets for 2030. You might remember there was a lot of buzz around this Fit for 55 package. And now this is the time to set another interim target between 2030 and 2050 for 2040. And the idea is that the Commission is going to propose quite an ambitious target of minus 9% net.
And in the current climate where we find ourselves, what are the expectations that something like that will actually happen?
It's tricky. That's very true. But I mean, the Commission is definitely putting a lot of weight behind it. And there's a whole group of member states, the usual suspects, the very pro-climate ones that support this target fervently. There are some worries. I imagine it's quite a high number. So there are worries that countries that, naturally a bit slower when implementing environmental regulation, maybe they see more opposition. Countries with the industry that is struggling to decarbonize. So it will be a big battle. Definitely, it's a political decision at the end of the day. So we expect that some negotiations will happen around this target. But at the same time, it's really important to set an ambitious interim milestone because if you think of it, between minus 55 and 100, quite a big difference. So the more we can accommodate this ambition for an interim moment, the easier it will be on the last decade. Because I think the last thing we want is to have the most radical change to happen in the last decade, because then there is a high risk that we're just not going to make it.
And so in this critical year of revision of the EU climate law, what is Carbon Gap advocating for, and what are here the opportunities that are presenting for CDR?
For the climate law, our biggest ambition is to make sure that it accounts for CDR, that it recognizes CDR explicitly. Actually, it already does so, but just a portion of CDR. It has a target or like a capped contribution from the nature-based CDR. This is what's called the Land Use Change and Forestry Regulation, the LULUCF, the most adorable acronym in EU law. But now we're thinking about what about permanent CDR, because back when we were negotiating the climate law, the first one in 2021, I say it like I was there, but I was in university. But back then, it was very difficult to imagine a solid contribution from permanent CDR because it was just such a small sector. But a lot of progress has been made since then. And looking into 2040, we can see quite a substantial contribution that's in the projection. So it is a good time to start thinking about what do we want, which types of permanent CDR, how much of it will go into climate law. So this is our main hope for this process. We understand the importance of preserving a lot of political capital to focus on the 90%. It is the most important thing. But at the same time, there are a lot of good reasons to have targets for carbon removals, and maybe I can quickly go through them. I have three. So first of all is what we call mitigation deterrence prevention. Mitigation deterrence is a process where we would over-rely on this idea of CDR that's going to come later down the line and save us all and fix everything. So we, as a result, slow down our emission reduction efforts. And this is just a no-go, Emission reductions need to continue and CDR need to start scaling up, but at the same time, not instead of emission reduction. So having separate targets, having separate governance, it will really help to establish the non-fungibility of these two. And it's really, really important. Then there is the point of centralized policy planning. There are a lot of member states that are thinking about CDR. We know this. There are member states that already have deployment mechanisms, support, grants, options. So that's all great. But then there is a whole share of member states that are nowhere near even starting to think about it because there's a lot going on, fair enough. But it creates quite a big discrepancy. And to have the capacity that we need for CDR by 2050, we need to have more uniformity. And this is where EU usually steps in and it sets an EU-wide target. And then based on, economic capacity, we allocate share to member states. And then finally, it's the market signal. So we spoke a little bit earlier about the need for demand. that the sector is struggling a little bit. They've made a huge push in the last few years, but it's very hard when it's like 10 buyers, right? So we need to understand, we need to have clear vision from the EU about what it wants to do with CDR, how much CDR, what type, and by when. So this is where a quantifiable target for 2040 would come really useful. And, CDR sector is fairly new. There are a lot of things that we're disagreeing on. There are a lot of novel opinions, but separate targets is definitely something that we're all in favor. One target for emission reductions, one target for carbon removal, and ideally also a distinction between these nature-based solutions and permanent solutions, because it's very dangerous to mix them up, put them in the same bucket, because then you end up with greenwashing practices.
I have just one more question for you. What would be the one milestone in the field of CDR that if it were to happen, it would make you feel like, okay, now my job is done?
Well, I've been working on the climate law ever since I joined Carbon Gap, which was exactly a year ago to the day. And so far, obviously, I'm working with this hypothetical legislation that's not even, the proposal is not even published yet. So to have a target, I would be like, I can retire. It's all good. I've done my part. But, we're pragmatic, we're realistic. A target is a big word, and some countries don't want to hear about targets anymore. We've over-targeted ourselves. So maybe it's a contribution. Maybe it's a mandate for the Commission to think about a target later down the line. It doesn't have to be climate law. Ideally, it is, because it just makes sense. It is the cornerstone policy from which a lot of other regulations stem from. But at the end of the day, if it's in 2 years when the Commission is working on the, let's call it a Fit for 90 package, an implementing package, and there is something in there, a target, that's also okay. But realistically, we shouldn't really be wasting our time, because the value of death is approaching. Again, we're talking about startups. We're talking about like a very young, very fragile sector that needs support. And a target is a mandate for these support measures.
And that's it for today's show. I'm Catarina Vila Nova, and Policy Voices will be back again next week. Until then, goodbye.